When Vargas finishes his magnum opus, there will be a landmark and a new symbol for the City of Angels. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Los Angeles.
Hello there, this is Al Jazeera and these are our top stories. Iran has seized the British oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. The Revolutionary Guards say the ship is being detained for violating maritime regulations. UK Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt condemned the move as unacceptable. US President Donald Trump says the seizure of the tanker proves he was right to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. The US military has stepped up air patrols in the region and contacted ships there to ensure their safety.
So we're going to be speaking with the UK, and this only goes to show what I'm saying about Iran. Trouble, nothing but trouble. And remember this, the agreement, the ridiculous agreement made by President Obama expires in a very short period of time. It was a short-term agreement. When you're dealing in countries, you have to deal in 50 years and 100 years. You don't deal in the short term. That was a ridiculous agreement.
Well, Iran has released a video. It says discredits claims that the U.S. shot down one of its drones. The Revolutionary Guard says this video is filmed by the drone and proves it returned safely to base. Now, Turkey says its warplanes and drones have hit multiple targets in the Kurdish region of northern Iraq. The airstrikes were in response to the murders of one of its diplomats and 2 other people. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa is rejecting accusations that he deliberately misled Parliament. The allegations center on a donation by the company Bosasa to Ramaphosa's 2017 presidential campaign. The anti-corruption watchdog says Ramaphosa failed to report the $35,000 donation and denied any wrongdoing or any knowledge of the funds when asked about it in Parliament last year. The Netherlands has accepted it is partially responsible for the deaths of 350 Bosnian Muslims in the 1995 Srebrenica massacre. The Supreme Court said Dutch peacekeeping forces could have allowed the men to remain at a UN safe haven during the war. Inside Story is next.
A World War II row triggers a trade dispute in 2019. Japan and South Korea remain at loggerheads over the forced labor controversy of more than 70 years ago. So why has it come to the fore now, and how can it be resolved? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fully Batibo. A rift is deepening between South Korea and Japan over what happened during the Second World War. Japan, as occupiers of the Korean Peninsula, forced Koreans into work. The issue has always stirred up deep emotions, but tension has recently escalated. A South Korean man set himself on fire outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul on Friday. His death followed Japan's ban on some exports to South Korea, imposed after a court ruled that Japanese firms should compensate the victims of forced labor. Japan's foreign minister summoned the South Korean ambassador when Seoul rejected a proposal for arbitration with a third country.
It's very regrettable that an arbitrator or third country arbitration has not been set up. In addition, I strongly urge the South Korean government to take immediate steps to correct this violation of international law.
That drew a strong response from South Korea.
It was Japan who violated international laws by committing unhumanitarian illegal acts. Our Supreme Court ruling pointed out that fact. Also, Japan has continued to demand a resolution of this issue through arbitration to settle problems concerning property and claims, but we never agreed with the unilateral deadline set by Japan.
So how did we get here? Well, relations between the two countries have been fractious for decades since Japan occupied the Korean Peninsula between 1910 and 1945. But things came to a head last year. In October, South Korea's top ordered Japanese companies to compensate Koreans who were forced to work for Japanese occupiers during World War II. Japan said the issue had already been settled under a 1965 treaty and threatened visa restrictions and tariffs. Then, this month, Japan restricted exports of 3 chemicals vital to South Korea's electronics industry, citing national security concerns. So far, Seoul hasn't taken any countermeasures, saying it would raise the dispute with the World Trade Organization. But some Koreans are taking the matter into their own hands and boycotting Japanese products. Well, let's bring in our guest now for today's Inside Story. Joining us by Skype from Tokyo is Tomohiko Taniguchi, who is a special advisor to the cabinet of Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. In Hong Kong, Robert Kep, director of the Economist Corporate Network. And by Skype from Stuttgart in Germany, Simon Ku, who is a publisher of the Korean Expose, an online news magazine that focuses on contemporary South Korea. Welcome to the program, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being with us. Mr. Tomohiko Taniguchi, if I could start with you in Tokyo. Japan said it's restricting exports to South Korea because of national security. What exactly are Japan's concerns and what is at the core of this dispute?
Sir? Text message.
These 3 materials that you cited are extremely important because they are potentially going to be used for dual purposes, one civilian, another military. Given the sensitivity, South Korea and Tokyo have made consultation mechanism at work. But one has to say that the hasty fashion that South Korean customers have urged the Japanese to provide them with materials, ending up with a near breaching of the regime that we are all after, that I mean South Korea and Japan are after. And that consists, arguably, a source of security concerns, as you mentioned.
Mr. Taniguchi, is the Japanese move to restrict exports from South Korea not retaliation for the South Korean force ruling that allowed assets of Japanese companies to be seized and used to compensate victims of the wartime forced labor? Is that not retaliation?
These 2 are completely separate issues because the export control regime is strictly under the Japanese government decisions, and it is, as a result, by nature, a domestic decision, as has been the case with many other exporters exporting some sensitive materials to other countries, such as South Korea.
Okay, let's hear from Siwon Ko in Stuttgart. Mr. Taniguchi says the Japanese move is a separate issue. It has nothing to do with the court rulings in South Korea. Would you agree with that? What's deepened the tensions as far as South Korea is concerned?
Well, this is certainly the line that we have heard from the administration of Shinzo Abe, that the export restriction has nothing to do with the development in South Korea over what Japanese companies should do with regard to compensating victims or forced laborers during the colonial period. As far as the government in Seoul is concerned, and as far as the public is concerned, these 2 are completely related matters, and the timing is most extraordinary. In fact, the measure has taken the government in Seoul quite by surprise, and we have not really seen any official measure coming from the government yet. But of course, the situation only gets worse by the day, and unfortunately, the damage to the bilateral relations is going to be quite extraordinary.
Siwon Ko, Japan's position is that the issue of compensation was addressed in the 1965 treaty that normalized relations between the 2 countries, and so Japan already gives millions, hundreds of millions in aid and loans to South Korea. Why is this coming to the fore now? What is the issue for South Korea?
We have to accept that there has been a significant change on the South Korean political landscape. 2 years ago, we had a new president elected, Moon Jae-in, And one of his campaign promises was
Can I
actually to
bring
revisit
Is
the
it? Can I
agreement
go
to take
between
water?
Japan and Korea
Yeah,
to address
just
the issue of
Okay,
comfort women.
okay.
It was supposed to be final when the agreement was signed in 2015, but the public opposition to this was quite significant. The government currently in Seoul has taken a harder line on the issue, and they have maintained that they will not see what they perceive to be a turn by the Abe administration toward the more right-wing tendencies, not just over the issue of wartime crimes, but also over the issue of Dokdo or Takeshima, the rocks between Korea and Japan that have been disputed by the two countries for quite some time.
All right, Robert Kep, let's talk about the economic implications of this dispute. The U.S.-China trade war has already resulted in quite a lot of negative shocks for Asian trade flows. Do you think this dispute between the other two big economies of the region has the potential to escalate into another trade war?
Well, it certainly has the beginnings of one, and it's worth pointing out that actually South Korea and Japan had been suffering from the impact of the U.S.-China trade war because they are very much integrated in this global supply chain, which is centered around China, or has been. And so when the tariffs are put on Chinese exports, in fact, it's South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, very significantly the high-tech area that feed into that. So they've already been suffering, and now they have this dispute brewing. I guess the one silver lining to this is the export controls involve a review period. So there's like a 90-day window from which the two sides might be able to reach some sort of resolution. But if there isn't a solution to the impasse, I'm afraid it could make a bad situation much worse.
Japan has said it may escalate measures in August. How far can they actually take this, especially given that Japan's exports have been falling because of the U.S.-China trade war, as I said?
Well, that's the interesting thing. So currently, when you look at these very specialized components, they represent about 1% of the value of Japan's exports to South Korea. So things like hydrogen fluoride are very important to South Korean chip manufacturers and panel manufacturers, but they aren't very important to Japan's export base. But if indeed they start ratcheting up tension, not only will their own companies, of course, suffer as a consequence, just as, by the way, American companies and consumers suffer under tariffs that are just increasing the cost of inputs from China. But there's another factor that needs to be considered, and that is retaliating. This is where you get what's known as a tit-for-tat trade war. And if things get more and more heated, the ramifications for those two economies and the global economy could become bigger and bigger.
Mr. Taniguchi, Japan says it may escalate the measures. Will it go as far as removing South Korea from its list of preferred trading partners?
Perhaps the list you just referred to is some list that listed 29 countries with which Japan has given blanket permission when it comes to exporting sensitive materials to the importers. But South Korea has been the only and sole nation in the entire part of Asia that Japan has maintained this arrangement over the last 15 years. European Union has given no such permission outright to South Korea. Japan has given no such permission to other members of Asia. So South Korea is going to return back to where it was, 2004. And in addition, no ban whatsoever, either about the three sensitive materials or in the future, other materials, is going to be imposed upon Japan's export. It's going to make the process slower and cumbersome, if you like. But that's the one any country is having with any other country.
Siwon-ko, the economic aspect of this relationship has been the glue supporting political cooperation between South Korea and Japan until now. To what extent are South Korea's domestic politics complicating the situation? And do you think there is a certain willingness domestically to improve things with Japan?
No, I would say this is very unlikely. The timing of the situation is most unfortunate because Korea already was feeling the pressure from the trade war between China and the US, and there was a lot of hand-wringing domestically over what the government could do to improve the business climate. And then came this move by Japan, and building on the existing anti-Japanese sentiment in Korea, which is very widespread, it's put tremendous pressure on the government to not yield to any demand by the Abe administration. The government has said it is open to diplomatic negotiations or compromise with Japan.
If they're open to diplomatic negotiations, as you say, why did they reject third-party arbitration?
Well, there is certainly the danger that if the matter goes to a third party, South Korea might not get the ruling that it wants. It is also the case with the situation over Dokdo or Takeshima, which South Korea effectively controls, and Japan has increasingly asserted that should be returned to its control. And Japanese have called for third-party administration, or at least a case with the International Court of Justice to resolve this. But this is an issue that South Koreans have not been interested in pursuing.
Robert Kep, which side is suffering the most, and which side will suffer the most if this is not resolved, Japan or South Korea?
Well, currently it would be South Korea is more exposed because its manufacturers are so dependent on those specialty materials from Japan. It's worth pointing out that Japan is not the only source, but it is the primary source. It has the right quality that manufacturers rely on, and it's already integrated in their supply chains. However, it could be that Japan ends up suffering again if this starts to escalate. One thing that, for example, South Korea has that's very important to Japan is tourists. It's the second largest source of tourists to Japan after China, which, by the way, is another country where there's often these political flare-ups of a cultural history.